After more years than I care to admit as a tax lawyer, I returned 5 years ago to the study of theology. And I admit that that return was partly a desire to escape tax law. The attempt was not altogether successful. My supervisor, my Ph.D. supervisor at Aberdeen, convinced me that I would be a whole lot more interested in my Ph.D. project if I built on my background. Turns out he was right, because as I began to excavate the 2,000 years or so of theological reflection in the Christian tradition on taxation, I discovered that it might shed some light on a question that had puzzled me throughout my years as a tax lawyer. Namely, is taxation an instrument of justice, or is it just a necessary evil, an unavoidable means of raising revenue? The current tax conversation in America is characterized by deep confusion and anxiety over the purpose of taxation. Should tax be an instrument of achieving a standard of fairness in society, or a standard such as greater economic equality, less economic inequality? Or do high taxes and highly redistributive taxes undermine economic growth and thereby reduce the amount of revenue that the government is ultimately able to receive? We as a society are confused about the purpose of tax because I think we are deeply uncomfortable with the two standards by which we typically judge tax systems to be either good or bad. Those standards are efficiency and equity. By efficiency, I mean how little does a tax system distort market-driven decision-making? Equity has lots of definitions, but the one that is most controversial refers to a tax system's potential for redistributing wealth. There is no doubt, I think, that we understand intuitively that each of those standards, equity and efficiency, standing alone will defeat the purpose of taxation itself. If the guiding principle for taxation is efficiency, then the best tax is going to be no tax at all. If the guiding principle of taxation is greater economic equality, then tax rates at the highest income levels are likely to be so confiscatory that the tax system will have zero chance of political success. There's only one solution, and I think we know it intuitively. The only solution is that a balance of competing considerations, and particularly a balance of these two standards, is essential for tax policy. Each one standing alone will defeat tax policy. It needs the other as a counterweight. And the first thing I discovered as I began to excavate the theological history of reflection on taxation is that the theologians in the Christian tradition tended to think that tax justice consists of that balance. The balance actually resides, or tax justice actually resides in the balance. Anything that the theologians said about tax, they almost immediately corrected with a counterweight. John Calvin, for instance, said in the Institutes that taxation was legitimate. This was not an undisputed proposition in the 16th century. Taxation was legitimate because it supported the public office of the rulers. But in the very next paragraph in the Institutes, he said, taxation is, as it were, taxes are, as it were, the very blood of the people, which it were the harshest inhumanity not to spare. Now, saying that tax justice resides in the balance of competing social values does not really get us very far because we need to know what that balance is. What I discovered in looking at the theologians, and this is the second thing that I found, is that the tax balance for them centered on material need, material necessity. That was the fulcrum. Necessity, not economic equality or the reduction of economic inequality, provided what I would call the justice element in this tax equation. The development of material need as a theological concept came about like this. In classical antiquity, writers like Cicero felt that the primary purpose of the state was to protect and preserve its citizens' property. And therefore tax had to be a last resort, a very last resort, because taxation was an interference with the citizens' property. In other words, property was sacrosanct in his political theology. The early Christians took a different view, focusing instead on the use that one makes of property and not property itself. Augustine, for instance, said, if you use property badly, you possess it wrongfully, and wrongful possession means that it's someone else's property. This idea that I could possess something that morally belongs to someone else blurred the distinction between benevolence and justice. The theologians drew the line between rightful and wrongful possession at the point where necessities become superfluities. Augustine said, the superfluities of the rich are necessary to the poor. By holding on to superfluous items, you are keeping what belongs to another. And Thomas Aquinas ultimately described this meeting point between necessitas and superflua as the place where human law and natural law meet. Natural law, he said, dictates that all things be held in common, because that's the way God created them. Human law, however, quite rightly advocates private property, because without private property, humans would not have the incentive to maintain and improve things. Nevertheless, Aquinas insisted, natural law continues to surround and limit human law so that the need of the poor causes natural law to come to the fore again. And at that point, things lose their characteristic as individual properties and become available to all those who need them. The theological and social upheaval of the Lutheran Reformation transferred this idea of moral indebtedness of property from the realm of voluntary charity to the realm of government-administered poor relief. Martin Luther, decrying the medieval symbiosis in which the rich sought their salvation by giving alms to the poor and were puffed up with spiritual pride because of what they had done, advocated the creation of common chests that would provide for the needs of the poor. Actual pieces of legislation, like the Leisnig Ordinance, to which Luther wrote a preface, provided for the ongoing maintenance of the common chests through regular and universal taxation. And Luther's commitment to redistributive taxation of this sort stems from his theology of the Lord's Supper, in which the believer receives all good things, material and spiritual, from Christ who has won them. And the place of abundance that the believer resides in as a result allows the believer to be free of concern and worry regarding whether the neighbor to whom the believer is going to distribute things in turn, whether that neighbor is actually entitled to them. Anticipating the objection that would resound through the coming centuries, Luther said, we can expect greed to creep in here and there, so what? Now, the question of economic inequality, which does so dominate our discussion of tax fairness at the moment in America, did enter the theological narrative, particularly in the sermons and commentaries of John Calvin. Calvin insisted that God ordains economic inequality, but he also insisted that God commands that we alleviate it. And he equips us with compassion so that we desire to alleviate it. The purpose of economic inequality in Calvin's political theology was to prompt us to meet each other's needs in a way that causes us to need each other and therefore binds us together and fosters human solidarity. In other words, Calvin reversed the connection between equality and solidarity that we usually see. We tend to think of greater economic equality as the goal and solidarity among humans as a happy byproduct that may or may not result along the way. For Calvin, the problem of economic inequality was the prompt, which drives us ultimately toward greater human solidarity as an end result. So the third thing that I learned to recapitulate, the third thing that I learned from the theological tradition is that we can and should think of tax systems as explicitly redistributive, but not in a way that seeks economic equality for its own sake. The primary task of tax systems, according to the theologians, is to provide for the material needs of all members of society so that they can achieve the level of human flourishing that society has decided is appropriate. The impulse toward correcting economic inequality, according to the theologians, is right and good, but it's only that, an impulse, a prompt. Our task should be to look to the needs of others, economic equality, perhaps economic growth will follow, or perhaps they won't. The theologians would remind us that in the final analysis, the outcome is hidden in God's mysterious will. So in summary, I would suggest that we have inherited the theological vision of redistributive taxation, but without the sense of security that the theologians had. We are frightened of terminology like need or redistribution because we think that if we follow those thoughts to their logical conclusions, they will deprive us of the good things of life. But the impulse persists, bubbling up from time to time, the impulse toward correcting economic inequality. The theologians would say that we should not reject that impulse, but we should view it as an impulse and not as a goal. Neither should we view efficiency as a goal. They would tell us that tax justice will only exist if we treat justice itself as a balance of these competing considerations centering on the meeting of human needs. Thank you.